A 7-year-old girl kneels in a puddle of dirty water,
Clean that up
her
now.
hands bleeding. Just a few feet away, her father watches, but he sees nothing wrong. What if the person hurting your child the most is the one you trust the most? After losing his wife, successful businessman Kwame buried himself in grief, leaving his daughter Amahle in the care of his new wife, Zinhle. But behind Zinhle's sweet smile hid a cruel heart, starving Amahle, destroying her mother's keepsakes, and erasing every trace of the woman who once held this home together. This is not just fiction. It's part of a series based on real emotional battles fought behind closed doors. Stories that awaken parents who've looked away for too long. Watch to the end and discover how a father who forgot how to love became his daughter's protector, how a single letter from a late mother stopped a scheme to steal everything, and how you might be missing the subtle signs of abuse hidden in plain sight. My name is Amahle. I'm 7. I was fed cold leftovers. I wasn't allowed to say Mommy's name, but today I sing at her piano because Daddy finally looked into my eyes. If you skip this story, you may miss the one clue your child is begging you to see. This is more than a film. It's a mirror for every parent. The rain had been falling for hours, heavy and relentless. A cold curtain drumming against the windows and the roof of the old house. Inside, the hallway light flickered, yellowed and weak, barely holding back the shadows that pressed in from every side. The tiles of the floor were slick with damp, glistening like glass, and in the center of that dim corridor a small figure knelt. Her dress was torn at the hem, soaked where the water had seeped under the door. Tiny hands, raw and bleeding, clutched a rag as she scrubbed at a stubborn dark stain on the ground. Each stroke sent a shiver through her thin arms. Her breath caught in sharp bursts, mixing with the hiss of the rain outside, making it sound as if the whole house itself was gasping. Behind her, measured and merciless, came the rhythm of shoes on the tiles. Tap, tap, tap. A steady beat that echoed like a clock marking down her punishment. Zinhle stood tall, her silhouette framed against the pale wall, eyes narrowed with a satisfaction too sharp to hide. "Harder," she said, her voice smooth but cutting, every syllable landing like the lash of a whip. The girl's shoulders flinched, though she did not speak. She dared not. Amahle pressed the rag harder until her knuckles whitened. The stain would not vanish, but she could not stop. The pressure of those footsteps behind her was heavier than any stone. Her hair clung damp to her face. A rivulet of water slipped down her cheek, indistinguishable from tears. The metallic tang of her own blood reached her tongue where she had bitten her lip to keep silent. The rag rasped, the stain smeared wider, and her chest burned with shame she could not name. For a heartbeat she let her gaze drift. The shallow puddle spreading near her knees reflected the harsh yellow light, fractured by ripples where her hands moved. In the surface shimmered her own eyes, wide, terrified, pleading, as though the floor itself was holding her despair. She quickly looked away, fearing even that mirror might betray her weakness. The door creaked at the end of the hall. Heavy steps entered, not measured but weary, dragging faint echoes with them. The sound did not belong to Zinhle. Amahle froze, rag mid-stroke, heart hammering. She turned slightly, hesitant, and there he was, Kwame, the man she still called father, though his presence had grown so rare. His coat was wet at the shoulders, his tie askew from the long day. He stopped short at the sight before him. For a breath, the only sounds were the rain outside and the drip of water from his umbrella onto the tiles. Amahle felt heat rush into her throat. Her lips parted, but no words came. She wanted to cry out, to beg him to see what was plain, but her body held her still, caught between fear of Zinhle's wrath and the desperate hope of rescue. Zinhle moved first. The hard edge vanished from her face as though wiped away. She stepped forward with a smile bright enough to deceive anyone less desperate to know the truth. "You're home early," she said lightly. She touched Amahle's shoulder, fingers pressing just enough to warn. "Look at her," she continued, "sweet as honey. She insisted on helping tonight, wanted to learn how to take care of the home. Isn't she precious?" The words slithered into the silence, too smooth, too rehearsed. Kwame's eyes darted from his wife to the child on the floor. He saw the rag, the streak of blood on Amahle's palm, the way her dress hung in tatters. Something hardened in his gaze, yet uncertainty clouded it, and he took a slow step closer. Amahle lifted her head, her eyes locked with his, shining from the wet tiles below. She did not speak, but in them lived the whole truth, a storm of fear, humiliation, and a silent cry, "See me, believe me." Her lips trembled as she held that gaze. Every second felt like a lifetime balanced on the edge of hope and despair. Kwame's throat tightened. He felt the echo of another time, another pair of eyes looking at him in the dim light, eyes that had once belonged to Lindiwe, the wife he buried too soon. That memory brushed him like a ghost, but the present weighed heavier. He hesitated. Amahle saw the hesitation. It pierced her deeper than any scolding, deeper than the sting of blood on her hands. She lowered her gaze, the puddle swallowing her reflection again. Her shoulders sagged as though the weight of silence itself had crushed her. Zinhle's smile widened. She touched Kwame's arm gently, her voice slipping into warmth. "She's trying so hard," she whispered. "It's good for her." Kwame's hand twitched, half rising as though to reach for his daughter. But it stalled midway. He stood between two truths, the one before his eyes, and the one dressed in charm beside him. His silence filled the hall, heavy, suffocating. Amahle's breath came shallow. The rag slipped from her fingers, floating limp in the puddle. She looked once more at him, her eyes hollow with the weight of all she could not say. The rain beat harder outside, drumming against the roof, as though urging an answer that never came. The light flickered overhead. Shadows stretched across the walls, and for a moment it seemed the whole house held its breath. Then the bulb steadied, and the silence pressed closer. Kwame's lips parted, but no words left. His gaze shifted, faltering, caught in the snare of doubt. Amahle bowed her head again, her lashes wet, her chest tight. The warmth of hope she had dared to feel moments ago slipped away, leaving a cold emptiness that mirrored the tiles beneath her knees. Her father was there, so close she could almost reach him. Yet in that moment, he felt farther than ever. The corridor dimmed as the rain smothered the world outside. The sound of Zinhle's shoes resumed their rhythm, sharp against the silence. Amahle stayed on the floor, small and trembling, her reflection broken in the water. The question hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. Would he see the truth, or let it drown beneath the lies? And the night stretched on, leaving only that question to carry into the dark. The house was silent long after the storm had moved on. The walls held the damp like a secret, seeping into every corner. Kwame lay in his bed, eyes open to the ceiling, his chest rising and falling with a weight that sleep could not touch. The sheets tangled around him felt like restraints. Every time he closed his eyes, the image returned. his daughter's small figure kneeling on the cold tiles, her hands raw, her eyes turned up to him like a prayer he had not answered. Her gaze still burned against his conscience. He pushed himself up, the silence in the room pressing too tightly. The clock ticked, steady and merciless, and he could no longer bear it. He slipped on his slippers, pulled his robe close, and wandered through the long hallway. The light fixtures hummed faintly above, some flickering as if reluctant to guide him. He stopped at the basement door. It had been years since he had opened it. The handle was coated in dust, a soft gray film that clung to his fingers. He hesitated, a strange reluctance twisting in his chest, but the silence behind him pushed him forward. He turned the key. The hinges groaned as the door swung open, exhaling a breath of stale air that smelled of rust and forgotten wood. The stairs creaked under his weight as he descended. His breath grew shallow with each step, the dim light from the hall barely following him down. At the bottom, the basement stretched before him, lined with shelves heavy with boxes, the kind that held the remnants of another life. He had avoided this place ever since Lindy Wee's death. It was easier to keep her confined here, among the cobwebs, than to face what was missing upstairs. He moved slowly, brushing dust off boxes until his hand landed on something different. A small wooden chest sat pushed against the wall, half hidden under a sheet. Its surface was scarred, the latch tarnished, but he knew it instantly. It was hers. The chest Lindy Way had kept for her private things. His breath caught, and his hand trembled as he touched it. The latch resisted before snapping open with a brittle crack. Inside, wrapped in faded linen, lay small keepsakes, a comb, a pressed flower, the corner of a photograph torn away, and at the bottom, a folded envelope yellowed with time. His name was written across it in Lindy Wee's careful script. He sank onto a wooden crate, his knees suddenly weak. He had never seen this letter before. With shaking fingers, he tore the seal. The paper was fragile, the ink smudged in places, but her voice came alive in every stroke of the pen. Kwame, if you are reading this, then life has been harsher to us than we dreamed. I beg you, if doubt ever clouds your heart, look into our daughter's eyes. They will never lie to you. Do not let anyone stand between you and her. Protect her, as I no longer can. The words blurred as tears swelled, spilling before he could stop them. He pressed the paper to his face, inhaling the faint trace of her perfume that lingered in the fibers. He remembered the promise he made at her grave, his hand clutching the soil, his voice raw. I will protect her. Always. Yet here he was, the image of Amahle's pleading eyes still haunting him, and he had stood frozen. He felt his chest cave under the weight of guilt. He crumpled forward, clutching the letter. His sobs broke into the silence, jagged and unrestrained. He was a man known for his strength, for his authority in boardrooms and on construction sites, but here, alone in the basement, he was nothing but a grieving husband and a failing father. The sound of his cries mingled with the faint drip of water leaking somewhere in the dark, a hollow rhythm that echoed his despair. The basement seemed to close in, its shadows wrapping around him like the arms of memory. He imagined Lindy Wee standing there, her gentle eyes watching, her voice urging him to rise, to be the man she had trusted. The letter trembled in his hands, glowing faintly under the weak bulb, as if it carried not only her words but her spirit. He sat there for what felt like hours, the night dragging on, his tears soaking into the paper. His breaths came ragged, his chest aching from the force of emotion he had kept buried for too long. When finally he lifted his head, his eyes were red, but something different lived in them. A flicker of resolve, fragile but alive. He pressed the letter back into its linen wrapping, set it carefully in the chest, and closed the lid. He whispered, voice cracking, "I will not fail her again." But as he climbed the stairs, the house remained silent, the shadows still clinging. The weight of Zinhle lingered upstairs, and though his heart had shifted, his courage had not yet found its full voice. He returned to his room with the letter still echoing in his mind, but his steps faltered. His promise was reborn, yet his fear of confrontation kept it chained. He lay back in bed, holding the memory of Lindiwe's words like a brand against his chest. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving only the dripping of water from the eaves. The night stretched thin, and with it came the unanswered question. Would he rise to protect Amahle, or let the silence consume them both? And in the stillness, Amahle's eyes haunted him, shining out from the dark like beacons, waiting to see if he would finally believe. The afternoon light poured through tall windows, muted by lace curtains that softened but could not disguise the sharpness in the air. Porcelain cups clinked against saucers, spoons stirred sugar into steaming tea, and the sound of polite laughter rolled across the sitting room. Zinhle's voice carried above them all, smooth and bright, the way silk shines even when stretched too tight. She moved among her guests with ease, her smile polished, her posture regal, her hand sweeping the air as she spoke of her home, her influence, her place at the center of this household. Amahle stood behind the curtain at the far corner, her small body pressed flat against the wall. The fabric smelled faintly of dust and old lavender, scratching against her cheek, but she didn't move. Her breath came shallow as she watched the women sip tea and nod at Zinhle's every word. The guests laughed at stories she knew were lies, tales of harmony in the home, of a dutiful stepdaughter eager to please. Amahle bit her lip, a sting of salt mixing with the faint sweetness of tea that drifted across the room. The clock on the mantel ticked louder than it should have. With every chime of laughter, Amahle felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were pressing her into silence. She clutched the hem of her dress, twisting it tighter in her fist, waiting for the moment the room would empty and her punishment would begin. When at last the door closed behind the final guest, silence fell heavy, broken only by the faint clink of porcelain being gathered. Zinhle's smile faded, her features sharpening back to steel. She set the last cup down on the tray, then reached for the phone. Her voice, moments ago honeyed, turned low and edged. Amahle froze as she heard the name. Neo. The tone in Zinhle's voice shifted further, sliding into something sly, something dangerous. Yes, everything is moving as we planned, Zinhle murmured, pacing across the rug. She's becoming easier to manage. I'll have her out of the way soon enough. A boarding school far from here, somewhere she won't be seen. That will give me the space I need. Amahle's small fingers clutched the curtain tighter. Her heart beat so loudly she thought it might betray her. She pressed her ear against the fabric, straining. Neo's voice came faint but clear through the receiver, deep and commanding. Don't delay. The papers must be ready. If Kwame hesitates, we'll push them through. His signature won't matter if we have what we need. By the time anyone notices, control of the company will be ours. The room swam around Amahle. She didn't understand every word, but she caught enough. Boarding school. Papers. Control. A cold dread seeped into her stomach. Her eyes flickered downward, and she noticed something small, Zinhle's thumb hovering over the phone screen, a string of digits glowing before the call connected. Amahle's mind, quick and desperate, memorized the number, repeating it silently as if it were the only lifeline she had. The call ended. Zinhle exhaled slowly, satisfaction in her smile once more. She glanced toward the curtain, suspicion flickering for just a moment. Amahle held her breath, body rigid as stone. After a pause, Zinhle turned and walked away, the click of her heels echoing like a gavel. Only when the footsteps faded did Amahle slip from her hiding place. Her legs trembled as she hurried to her room, the number still whispering in her mind. She reached for the small wooden music box that had been her mother's, hidden under the thin blanket on her bed. Its lid was chipped, its tune delicate, the last piece of her mother she could still hold. She turned the key, letting the soft melody fill the air, trying to soothe the storm rising in her chest. The door swung open without warning. Zinhle's shadow fell across the floor. For a moment her face was unreadable. Then she strode forward, her hand striking the box from Amahle's grasp. It hit the ground with a sickening crack, splintering into pieces, the music breaking off mid-note. The silence afterward was sharper than glass. Amahle dropped to her knees, gathering the shards in her hands, the edges cutting her skin. Her tears blurred them into smears of color and wood. She wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat, tangled with grief. Zinhle's voice came cool, almost bored. It was nothing but junk. Stop clinging to the past. She turned and walked out, the sound of her heels fading once again into the hall. Amahle curled over the broken pieces, pressing them to her chest as if she could will them back together. The room grew darker as evening fell, shadows stretching across the floor. Her sobs were small at first, then raw, shaking her thin frame. In that moment, the house itself seemed to echo her pain, the walls breathing with her cries. Her mother's music had been silenced, her hope shattered. Yet in the hollow of her grief, the number she had memorized still burned bright in her mind. A fragile thread of defiance she dared not let go, and as the night closed in, that number pulsed like a secret heartbeat, waiting for the day it would matter. Rain had washed the city clean by morning, but the house still carried a chill that crawled along the floors and up the walls. Light from the kitchen window fell in a thin, pale sheet across the table, catching dust that moved like slow snow. Kwame stood at the sink, holding a mug he had not sipped from, listening to the quiet that always felt louder after a storm. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant hiss of pipes, the tiny tick in the clock over the stove. Every sound made him feel alone in a place built for a family. He set the mug down. His fingertips rested on the counter, steadying himself. Then he walked toward the hallway. His shoes whispered over the tiles. At the far end, outside the small bedroom, a sliver of shadow moved. He paused, then knocked softly. No answer, only the hush of a sleeping house. He pushed the door open. Morning clung to the room in pale colors. The curtains were not quite closed, the light slipping in as if unsure it was welcome. Amahle sat on the edge of the bed, with her feet tucked beneath her, hair falling over her face, shoulders rounded. She held her hands close to her chest. Only when she turned a little did he see them. Angry red lines raking across small palms, scabs raised like rough threads pulled through skin. There were older marks, too, faded to a brown that spoke of wounds that had not been allowed to heal. He didn't realize he'd stopped breathing until the air sank back into him all at once. Something in his chest gave way. The letter from the night before rose like a wakeful star in his head. Look into our daughter's eyes. They will never lie to you. The words were not a memory anymore. They were a command. He took a single step forward, then another, and sat on the bed, leaving space between them. His voice came gentler than he thought he still knew how to make it. Let me see. She hesitated. The room held that thin, brittle pause, like a note stretched too far on an old violin. Then she opened her hands. He wanted to flinch, but he didn't. Instead, he reached for her with just the tips of his fingers, touching the edges where the skin was less raw. The contact was a whisper, skin to skin, father to child, almost nothing, but the current of it ran straight to his throat. "Who hurt you?" he said. Not a question, a plea. Her voice was almost too small to hear. "Please don't be angry. I am not angry with you." He let the words anchor into the air between them. "Tell me." She looked up. He saw it then, the same depth he had seen in the hall last night. Not a pool of fear alone, but a door waiting to be opened. Her mouth trembled once, and then the words came. She told him about the kitchen hours, the cold water, the floor she scrubbed until her fingers bled, about being sent to bed without dinner for speaking too loud, or for being too quiet, or for nothing at all, about the music box, the one her mother used to wind at night, shattered on the floor while the song was still trying to find its way out. "I kept the pieces," she whispered, almost as if confessing a theft. His jaw tightened, but he didn't let anger lead. He let grief go first. "Where?" She slipped off the bed and knelt by the far side, reaching under to pull out a scrap of cloth tied with a thin knot. She placed it in his hands as if handing him something alive. When he loosened the knot and unrolled the cloth, little shards glinted in the light. Splinters of wood still fitted with a sliver of brass, a bent crank pin, a torn scrap of velvet lining. He turned the pieces over, careful not to cut himself, careful as if the song itself might still be hiding there. His throat was thick. He felt the ache in his ribs the way one feels a bruise. He looked up at her and found her eyes braced for disbelief. They did not need to be. "Thank you for telling me," he said, each word given its full breath. "I hear you." Something small shifted in her face, not trust, not yet. Something like air entering a room that had been closed too long. He wrapped the cloth again and set the bundle on the bed. "We will fix this," he said. "But first, I need to understand everything. What time did you eat last night?" She pressed her lips together. "I didn't. And the night before." She shook her head. He stood. The room seemed colder now, but his mind had already found the path forward. He went to the tall cabinet by the window, the one with the family calendar, and the tidy columns of schedules, meals, school pickups, music lessons he had insisted on once, and then forgotten to ask about again. He lifted the calendar from its hook and scanned the neat blocks written in Zinhle's hand. Meal notes were checked off with small, confident ticks. He smoothed the page and found his own handwriting at the bottom of the month, notes to self from weeks ago he hadn't followed, and a sudden humiliation tightened the back of his neck. He set the calendar on the desk and opened the cupboard where the chore charts lived, color-coded in a way that always made him uneasy and grateful at the same time. He flipped through the sheets, the same ticks, the same notes. It all said one thing and his daughter's hand said another. He turned back to the bed. "Did you go to your music lesson this week?" "No. It's written here that you did." Her eyes dropped to the floor. "I waited in the laundry room with the door shut, so it would be quiet if you came home early." He closed his eyes for a heartbeat. He thought of the silence he'd come home to more nights than not, and how he'd let himself be led by it. When he opened his eyes, he was already moving. He stepped into the hall and called for the housekeeper. She came quickly, nerves already humming in her posture, smoothing her apron even before she reached the doorway. He softened his voice to a calm that had command in it. "What did she eat last night?" The woman flicked a glance toward Amahle and back, a slip of pity passing over her face like a shadow. I wasn't in charge of dinner. I was told she had eaten earlier. By whom?" She hesitated. "Mrs. Zinhle." He didn't allow the room to fill with any more air than it needed. "Thank you," he said, and dismissed her. Then he went to the pantry. The pantry was full, shelves tidy, jars labeled in careful script. He wasn't hungry, but the sight of it, this quiet wealth of food neat as a photograph, made a heat rise in him that had nothing to do with hunger. He lifted a jar and found the small thing only someone searching would see, a lock fixed inside the door frame, where a child's fingers could brush it and be turned away. He held it in his palm for a moment, thumb resting on the cold metal. Feeling the fact of it, he closed the door gently and returned to the kitchen. He took the family tablet from the counter, the one used to check deliveries and school notices, and pulled up the account for the caterer that had been providing weekday meals. He scrolled through the logs, his finger steady. The last 3 evenings were recorded as delivered for 2, not 3. His chest tightened as if an invisible hand had reached in and took a handful of breath. He printed those 3 invoices. The paper slid warm into his hand. He set them beside the calendar and the chore lists, building a small, quiet stack of truth. Then he remembered the number. "You told me something once," he said to Amahle, careful as he crossed back to the bedroom doorway. "The night before, when you were alone in the sitting room. You saw a number on a phone." Her eyes lifted, startled that he remembered a detail she'd given only the night before to herself. She nodded slowly and recited it, the digits falling from her tongue with the rhythm of a lullaby she must have used to hold them in memory. He wrote it down. The shape of those numbers sat in the center of the page with a weight far heavier than ink. He stepped aside and dialed it from the living room phone that still held a landline because he hadn't gotten around to canceling it. The call rang once, twice, then cut to a hollow quiet. He hung up and ran it through the caller ID memory for the house. A few days earlier, a call from that number had come in late at night. The line item marked it as brief. He printed that too. When he looked up, he found her watching him. Not with fear now, but with a caution that, if handled gently enough, could grow into something braver. He moved back to the doorway and crouched, so their eyes were level. "I should have asked sooner," he said. "I should have seen. I am seeing now." Her breath trembled in her chest. "Will she be angry that I told you?" "She may be," he said. Honesty had a steadiness his old comfort never did. "But she will not touch you again." It was then that something in her truly broke open. Not a flood, not relief. A hinge, oiled, surrendering. She gave a single small nod like a promise. He reached out and held his hands in the air just for a second, waiting for her permission. She leaned forward. He closed his arms around her, careful of her palms, careful of the tender places he could not see. She was so light, he wanted to apologize to the air for what he had allowed to happen to her inside this house. She did not cry, neither did he. Their breaths fell into the same rhythm. The clock over the stove kept time for them. When at last he pulled away, he stood and crossed to the desk in the hall. He slid the calendar into a folder with the invoices, the list of chores, the printout from the phone memory, and the scrap of paper with the number. He paused, then added the bundle of music box pieces on top. wrapped in its cloth. The shape of the bundle made the folder bow, like a body trying to protect what it carried. He closed it gently. Down the hall, a door opened. The housekeeper's steps retreated toward the back entrance. Somewhere upstairs, a faucet turned on and off. Water spoke through the pipes like someone thinking out loud. He listened to all of it, and not to any of it, hearing instead Lindywee's letter, the way one hears the sea beneath a city. Constant, invisible, enormous. Protect her, as I no longer can. He checked the time. Mid-morning. Zinhle would be home before lunch. The idea of a confrontation flared, then settled into a steadier flame. He walked back to the bedroom and reached for the first aid kit in the closet. "Let's clean your hands," Amahle said, and they sat together on the edge of the bed while he dabbed ointment along the red lines, tied gauze as gently as he could, and cut tape with hands that were used to contracts and blueprints, not bandages. She watched him with that small, wary hope. He held his clumsy work up for her to see, and when she offered the ghost of a smile, he felt the first true inch of ground under his feet in a very long time. They ate together at the kitchen table. He placed a bowl of porridge before her, and fresh fruit cut into the neat shapes he remembered she liked when she was little. She lifted the spoon, tasted, then ate without looking up, as if these few moments might disappear if she acknowledged them. He ate too, spoon after spoon, a mundane sacrament that steadied his hands more than any vow ever had. After, he walked the house, not with the distant owner's glance he used to carry, but with the eye of a father mapping a battlefield. The pantry lock, the overstocked cabinet of cleaners reachable to a child, the laundry room with the light bulb removed from the ceiling fixture so that when the door closed it plunged into a pocket of dark. He made a list in the margin of the calendar page. Light bulb, lock, access, writing each word slowly, like stakes driven into soil. In the sitting room, he found a stray shard of glass half hidden under the couch, thin as a fingernail. He knelt and picked it up, turned it in the light, then slid it into his pocket. In his head he could hear the tune that had been cut off. Not the notes, but the shape of them, the lift, the drop, the promise. He returned to the kitchen to find Amahle standing by the window, fingertips grazing the gauze, as if she had forgotten it was there. Sun caught in her hair, dust spun in the beam like tiny planets. He looked at her and saw not what had been done to her, but what had been left unguarded in himself. Whatever came next would test every room in this house and every corner of him. That was right. That was overdue. A car door thudded outside. The sound cut through the quiet like a bell. He moved to the window. A delivery van idled by the curb, the driver hauling up 2 crates marked for the kitchen. Ordinary, harmless. Still his heart surged. He steadied it with a breath. Behind the van, another car rolled past slowly, a sleek shape he recognized through the leaves. His brother's model, not his brother's license plate. He watched the car hesitate at the corner, then continue, vanishing as if it had only been a thought in his own head. The skin on his arms prickled. He told himself the house had made him jumpy. Perhaps it had, or perhaps caution had finally come home. He turned back to Amahle. "I have to make a few calls," he said. "You will hear voices. If anyone asks you to do anything that hurts you, you come to me. If you can't find me, you go to the front porch and stand by the big potted plant and call my name. I will come." She nodded. "I know the plant." The smallest comment, but it steadied him more than it should have. He picked up the folder, The papers inside made a flat, quiet sound. He held it to his chest for a second, the way you hold a book that matters, then set it down again. "One more thing," he said. "Do you remember the lullaby your mother used to hum when the music box was winding down?" Amahle tilted her head. She touched the gauze with her teeth, then let her hand drop. She hummed, just a handful of notes, fragile, unfinished. It hung in the kitchen air and then folded into the day. He didn't realize he was gripping the chair back until the muscles in his forearm cramped. "Thank you," he said softly. "Keep that with you." She pressed her lips together and nodded once, solemn as a promise. Footsteps sounded at the front. Keys, the rasp of a lock, the shape of someone who lived here stepping into the threshold as if nothing in the world could resist her. Zinhle's perfume arrived a beat before she did. Citrus cut with something bitter, clean and cold as polished marble. He placed himself between the kitchen and the hall. For a breath he felt the old habit, the smile, the polite question, the seeding of ground before the first word. It came to the door of him and found it shut. He kept his voice even. "We need to talk." Her gaze flicked over his shoulder to the child, then back. "Of course," she said, soft as velvet. "About what?" He lifted the folder. He didn't open it. He didn't need to yet. "About this family." She tilted her head, the curve of her mouth a mirror. "Then talk." He looked at the bandages in the corner of his eye. He thought of the pantry lock, the missing light bulb, the invoices, the number. He thought of a grave and a promise and a letter that had come back to life to stand at his shoulder. When he spoke again, he did not feel alone in the room. "Not here," he said. Not in front of her. For a second, something hard flashed behind her eyes. The curve of her mouth held. "As you wish," she said, stepping aside to let him pass. He turned to Amahle. "I'll be in the study. You stay here. If you need me, call." She nodded, clutching the edge of the table, small fingers whitening on the wood. He walked down the hall with the folder in his hand. The study door waited, dark wood, polished to a sheen by years of work that had built a life he was only now learning how to inhabit. He opened it and stepped inside, the smell of paper and ink and leather wrapping him. Behind him, the house shifted into a new shape, one where a father had chosen a side. He placed the folder on the desk but did not sit. He stood and let his palms flatten against the surface, feeling the grain, feeling the steady drum of his own pulse beneath his skin. He could hear her footsteps approach outside and then stop. He could hear the faint scrape of her nail against the door frame, delicate, like a warning drawn lightly on skin. He could hear from the kitchen far down the hall the soft hum of a tune that had not been allowed a full life. He closed his eyes and let that sound fix his heart to the right place. The doorknob turned. He lifted his head. The house exhaled, and in that thin space before the first word, he knew there would be no turning back. The dining room shimmered with a deceptive warmth. Candles glowed low in their holders, flames steady and civilized, reflecting in the polished silverware lined neatly across the long table. Plates had been set for 4, though only 3 were needed. The 4th sat empty, a ghost place that seemed to watch them all. The air smelled faintly of roasted meat and cinnamon wine, a richness that clung to the edges of the room but could not mask the undercurrent of tension pulsing through it. Amahle sat stiff in her chair, small hands folded in her lap, her gauze-wrapped palms hidden beneath the tablecloth. Her dress was too big for her frame, the collar slipping sideways, as if even the fabric refused to fit the child she had been forced to become. Beside her, Zinhle carved slow, graceful strokes through her meal, each movement precise, each smile sharpened into performance. And then, as if summoned by the silence itself, the front door opened. Heavy steps crossed the foyer, purposeful, confident. Neo appeared in the threshold, his suit cut sharp, his expression warmer than the air deserved. He moved toward Amahle with the ease of a man who believed he belonged everywhere he went. "Little one," he said smoothly, bending just enough to bring his face closer to hers. He pulled a box from his jacket pocket, wrapped in ribbon, bright against the muted tones of the table. He slid it toward her with a smile that did not touch his eyes. "A gift, something to remind you you're loved." Her fingers twitched against the cloth, but she didn't reach for it. She stared at the box as though it were alive. The ribbon shimmered under candlelight. Her silence stretched until it became heavier than words. Zinhle's laugh cut in, airy and dismissive. "She's shy. You know how children are." Kwame's fork clinked against his plate. He did not speak. His eyes, steady, flicked to Amahle, then back to Neo. His silence was not empty. It bristled, watchful, gathering weight. The meal resumed in a strained imitation of civility. Knives against porcelain. The shifting of glasses. Neo filled the space with conversation, stories of meetings, suggestions for company ventures, compliments directed at Zinhle's hospitality. His voice wove a thread meant to bind the room together, but each word only deepened the fracture. When the plates were cleared and the candles burned lower, Kwame excused himself with a measured calm. He stepped into the hall, but he did not leave. Instead, he lingered just beyond the archway, the shadows of the corridor wrapping around him like an ally. Neo's voice drifted from the sitting room, no longer smoothed for performance. "We cannot delay. If he hesitates, the board will side with me. The papers are nearly ready." Zinhle's reply was sharper, laced with impatience. "Do you think I enjoy waiting? The girl complicates everything. Once she's gone, he will be easier to break." Kwame's breath stilled. He pressed closer to the wall, the grain of wood cool beneath his fingertips. Their words dripped into him, slow and poisonous, but each syllable also sharpened his focus. Neo's tone hardened. "Tomorrow. The arrangements are made. She leaves for boarding school at first light. While she's out of the way, we finalize the documents. By the time Kwame notices, he'll be irrelevant. The signatures will say he's incapable of leading. I'll handle the company. You handle him." The air seemed to pulse in Kwame's ears. He leaned back, his hand gripping the banister. The promise from the basement, the letter in his wife's handwriting, surged through him like fire through dry grass. He turned, moving silently down the hall, his steps deliberate but trembling with fury held in check. In the solitude of his study, he reached for the phone. His voice, low and urgent, carried the weight of a man standing at the edge of betrayal. "Thabo," he said when the line connected, "I need your counsel tonight." The lawyer's voice was calm, practiced, yet alert. "Tell me everything." Kwame did. He spoke of the bruises, the bandages, the broken music box, the falsified schedules. He spoke of the overheard plan, the number memorized, the invoices. The words came like stones, building a wall of evidence. On the other end, Thabo's pause was brief, but deliberate. "It's enough to start. But for the law to hold, you'll need more than your word. Get proof, hard proof. My advice, bring Kabilo in. He can help you record everything, but it must be done within the law's reach. Otherwise, it will crumble Kwame's jaw set. Then we'll do it properly. I won't fail her again. The line clicked, silent. Kwame's hand shook as he lowered the receiver, but his eyes were steady. He walked back to the dining room, pausing in the doorway. Neo and Zinhle were laughing at something half true and half lie. They stopped when they saw him. I'll see you both out, he said, tone neutral, polite enough to pass. His gaze lingered on Amahle. She sat motionless, her hands folded, her eyes lowered but glimmering with the knowledge of what had been said when she thought no one heard. The night folded in around them. Neo departed first, his cologne trailing a sharp scent of power and arrogance. Zinhle followed, her hand brushing Kwame's arm with feigned tenderness. He stood still until the door shut, until their footsteps were swallowed by the dark. Then he moved to the mantel where the framed photo of Lindiwe still rested. Her smile was caught forever in black and white. The corners of her eyes creased in the way they had when she was happiest. He touched the glass, his voice low, breaking against the weight of guilt. I may let them near her, he whispered. His breath fogged the frame, his hand pressed harder. But never again. Do you hear me? Never again. His words lingered in the room like a vow carved into stone. The flames of the candles trembled as if bearing witness. Somewhere in the quiet hall, Amahle shifted in her chair, clutching her gauze-wrapped hands, waiting for morning to decide her fate, and the house itself seemed to hold its breath, balanced on the thin edge between betrayal and reckoning. The evening unfolded like a stage dressed for civility, yet every detail whispered tension. The dining room glowed with soft lamps instead of candles, their light a little too warm, a little too deliberate. The table was set with care, linen napkins folded into triangles, silver polished until it caught and fractured the light. Bottles of wine waited unopened, dishes arranged in the center, as if generosity could erase suspicion. Kwame had chosen each detail with precision, not for his guests, but for the trap that hid beneath the surface. Amahle sat at the far end, smaller than the chair that held her, shoulders drawn inward, as though trying to disappear into the fabric. The scent of roasted chicken and herbs filled the air, but she hardly touched her plate. Her eyes moved constantly, darting to the corners, to the door, to the shadows in the hallway, where she imagined threats could appear. Her small hands twisted the hem of her dress, her gauze wrinkled and stained faintly with the day's wear. Zinhle arrived first, draped in a dress that caught the light in restless sparks, her perfume sharp enough to slice through the air. She smiled at the table, then at her husband, a smile that carried no weight of truth. Neo followed, his presence filling the room with confidence so heavy it nearly bent the air. He clapped Kwame on the shoulder with too much familiarity, then sat as if the chair had been waiting only for him. Conversation started light, shaped like a dance no one wanted to join. Neo spoke of markets and opportunities, of how the company's future needed steady hands and strategic vision. Zinhle chimed in with careful nods, her laugh a blade polished to sound like music. Kwame responded in measured tones, his face unreadable, his hands calm against the tablecloth. Beneath the surface, however, something else hummed, Cabello's careful work, hidden in the chandelier behind the framed painting on the wall, in the hollowed base of the lamp by the corner. The devices waited, alive and silent, recording every word. For a time, the evening resembled civility. Glasses clinked, food was passed, polite questions were asked. But like a mask slipping too soon, the real voices emerged when the plates were cleared and the wine loosened their tongues. Neo leaned closer, his tone shifting from charm to calculation. The papers are nearly complete. Once signed, control is ours. No one will question it. By next week, Kwame will be nothing more than a figurehead. Zinhle's eyes gleamed, her hand resting on the stem of her glass. And the girl? She complicates matters. The sooner she's sent away, the easier everything becomes. Tomorrow is best. The school will keep her quiet, and we will keep the house. Kwame's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression still. He listened, every syllable searing itself into the devices hidden around them. Neo's voice dropped lower. We'll present the documents while he's distracted. Signatures forged where needed. The board will side with evidence, not sentiment. He glanced at Amahle, his smile turning sharp. The child is a liability. Best she be removed quickly. The words cut the air like knives. Amahle's fingers clenched under the table. She shifted slightly, her elbow brushing against the vase that sat as the table's centerpiece. It wobbled, glass catching the light, then tilted dangerously toward the edge. Her breath caught. Her hand shot out too late. The vase tipped, its fall slowed only by luck, as it struck the table with a hollow thud, rolling toward the exact spot where Cabello had hidden one of the small devices. For a single heartbeat, the room froze. Neo's eyes snapped to the vase, his gaze sharpened like a predator's, suspicion flashing across his face. Careless child, he said, rising half an inch from his chair. He reached out, steadying the vase, but his eyes lingered, tracing the angle, the way it had nearly fallen, the space beneath it. His hand hovered just a moment too long. Amahle's throat tightened. She pulled her hands back, hiding them in her lap, trembling. The silence stretched, brittle as glass. Zinhle's laugh broke it, quick and too bright. She's clumsy, always has been. Don't mind her. She reached to stroke Amahle's hair, but the child flinched before contact. Zinhle's hand paused in midair, then withdrew smoothly, covering the insult with another laugh. Neo leaned back slowly, his suspicion not entirely erased. His eyes flicked once to Kwame, but Kwame's face remained calm, unbroken. The trap had not been sprung yet. Conversation resumed, but the air was thinner now, harder to breathe. The hidden devices caught every shift in tone, every quiet confession, every drop of venom disguised as strategy. When the evening ended, Zinhle gathered her shawl. Neo buttoned his jacket and both left, with smiles painted once again over their faces. The door closed behind them, their footsteps fading into the night. In the silence that followed, Kwame let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He moved quickly, retrieving the vase and checking the device hidden beneath. Still intact, still glowing faintly. Every word had been captured. He looked to Amahle, who sat pale and trembling at the table, her hands knotted in her lap. She lifted her eyes to him, wide and afraid, silently asking if they were safe. He crouched beside her, resting his hand gently over hers. "Not yet," he whispered, his voice steady, resolute. But soon, her gaze held his, fragile hope flickering behind the fear. The room, once heavy with deceit, seemed to pulse with a new weight, the weight of truth, finally caught and waiting to be set free. And upstairs, in the shadows of the quiet house, the recordings whispered like loaded weapons, ready to change everything. Morning came the color of ash. A thin light pressed through the cloud cover, flattening the city into quiet shapes. In the study, the desk lamp cast a cone of gold that cut through the gray. Papers lay in a tidy fan across the leather blotter. A pen waited, heavy and dark. A carafe of water beaded with condensation like a clock, sweating in anticipation. Kwame stood by the window with his hands on the sill, watching the street. Every passing car felt like a test of his resolve. He breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth until the breath steadied. Behind him, the house held itself taut, a bowstring pulled and ready. He heard the first set of footsteps before the knock. Zinhle never knocked. She flowed. She slipped into the doorway in silk that whispered when she moved, perfume following half a beat behind, bright citrus, with a bitter ending. "You're up early," she said lightly, as if sleep were a hobby. "You look focused." "Work," he said, without turning. "Paperwork." "Isn't it always?" Her gaze flicked over the desk, measuring the space between items, the way a person reads a room and its owner at once. "Neo will be here any minute. He has something he wants you to see. It'll make everything easier." "Easier," Kwame repeated, tasting the word. He turned then. "Where is she?" A soft shrug that was almost elegant. "Breakfast. The housekeeper made porridge. She's fine." He held her eyes, as if he could catch the lie by the tail and drag it into the light. "Good." The second set of footsteps arrived with a knock that pretended to be polite. Neo filled the doorway, suit sharp as a blade, smile warm enough to thaw a small glacier. "Brother," he said, crossing the rug with open arms that did not quite fit the space. "I come bearing solutions." Kwame gestured to the chair opposite the desk. "Sit." He took his own seat, slowed his breath again, and kept his face calm. The pen lay close to his hand. The desk lamp hummed. Neo placed a folder on the blotter. The paper inside was crisp, heavy, the kind chosen for things that pretend to be legitimate. "We've been worried," he began, voice gentle, concern sewn into its seams. "The company needs a steady hand. You've been distracted. Grief can do that to a man. It's only humane to ensure decisions don't fall through the cracks." Zinhle took the seat by the window, crossing one leg over the other. Her eyes glittered like polished stone. She said nothing at first, which was newer and more dangerous than when she spoke. Kwame opened the folder and looked down. Paragraphs marched across the page with purpose. Language about guardianship in business matters, temporary delegation of authority, oversight for the health of the organization. He read until he reached the signature line with his own name printed beneath it. He let his gaze rest there, unblinking. His heart thudded once, a heavy fist against a locked door. Neo leaned forward and slid the pen closer. "It's straightforward, a protective measure. You retain your role, of course. I simply shoulder more of the day-to-day. The board already favors the plan. This will reassure them. It's purely administrative." Kwame let the page sit a beat longer. The walls of the study held still. The leather chair creaked under him, the only witness to how tightly he gripped the armrest. Across the room, the small brass clock ticked, and in that tick he heard a lullaby hummed by a child the night before, soft and unfinished. He lifted his eyes to Neo. "Administrative?" "Entirely." Kwame drew his phone from his pocket, set it face down to his right, and angled the paper so the desk lamp lit it evenly. He slid his reading glasses on. "Where did this come from?" "The firm," Neo said smoothly. "We had counsel draft it. You'll recognize the letterhead." He did. It mimicked the real firm's mark with unnerving skill, but the spacing between letters in the header, the tiniest gap, was wrong. He let his gaze move, almost lazy, over a footnote that misquoted a bylaw. Ink bled minutely at a comma. Dust in the machine. Men in a hurry. His thumb, hidden by the curve of the desk, tapped the phone once. The screen woke long enough to catch the light. He took up the pen, gripped it the way he'd held a hammer once, long before offices and boardrooms, when he was still learning what weight felt like in his hands. He exhaled, bent over the page and put the nib to paper. He wrote his name slowly, each letter deliberate, a careful performance. As he lifted the pen, he stilled his wrist, and in that pause, his other hand closed over the phone and tilted it. The camera clicked so softly it could have been a breath. He sent the image in 3 motions, tapped the message thread already open with Thabo, tap send, hold the phone against the underside of the desk where the signal was strongest, and tap one more time on the small paper clip where 2 more images waited. Last night's invoices, the lock he had found in the pantry. Paper joined paper, true joined true. Across from him, Zinhle's mouth curved, triumph practiced. Neo relaxed back, satisfaction loosening his shoulders as the pen returned to the blotter with a short, polite sound. He folded his hands. "There," he said softly. "This puts things in order." "Order," Kwame said, and returned the folder, the signature visible, the small curve of his final E riding the line like a hook. Neo slid the paper into his briefcase with a swift, almost greedy movement. "You won't regret this." The phone on Kwame's desk buzzed. He placed his palm over it casually, as if steadying a book in a draft. He glanced at the screen. 1 message from Thabo, no words, only a single red exclamation and a timestamp, followed by the image he had sent, returned with a mark around the letterhead and the footnote number. A second message followed, this time text. Forged. Hold steady. "I'm outside." The study brightened by a fraction. Outside. The word hit his bloodstream like oxygen. Neo stood with a cheerful sigh, reached for the briefcase, then paused to look around the study the way a man looks at a thing he believes he will soon own. "I'll bring this to the board," he said. "They'll be relieved." "Why so much rush?" Kwame said lightly, lifting his glass for a sip of water to keep his voice even. "Could we not?" "Now, not this time," Zinhle cut in, and the softness in her tone cracked. "Delay kills progress. You of all people should know that." Kwame set the glass down. "Where is Amahle?" Her smile returned thin as foil. "Packing. Her new school expects punctuality." The words landed like a slap he had seen coming and chosen not to dodge. In the hall, faintly, he could hear movement. The housekeeper's steps, a drawer sliding closed, the quiet rustle of a child who had learned how to be small. He looked at his watch as though checking a meeting time. Instead, he pressed a button at its side, a tiny movement masked by the gesture. The watch face pulsed once against his skin. A signal moved through wood, through walls, through the ribs of the house and out the front door, down the steps, to where a car idled with its engine off, and a man in a plain jacket glanced up at the sudden angle of a bird leaving the hedge. "Before you go," Kwame said, "I have a question." He made it sound like business. He let the pause grow just long enough to move oxygen into the room and set it on fire. "How long have you been speaking to my brother after midnight?" Zinhle's head tilted, a flash in her eyes, quick and careless, like a blade turning to show it was already wet. "Don't be childish." Neo's smile thinned. "It's normal to coordinate. We're family." Family. Kwame savored the word until the salt in it showed itself. He slid open the top drawer, took out a single sheet and set it on the blotter. A printout of the house phone's call log, one number circled in pen. This called the house 3 nights ago at 1:22 a.m. That same number was dialed from your cell, Zinhle, at 1:21. I have the carrier record. It was routed through a block you thought would hold. He tapped the circle. It didn't. Zinhle's lips parted, not surprise, insult. So you snoop now. I document, he said. Neo's eyes hardened. The friendly uncle slipped off like a coat. This is tedious. We're done here. He turned toward the door. The handle clicked under his hand. The study door didn't move. Neo tried again. Harder. The latch resisted, held by a lock meant to slide smooth, but now cushioned by the pressure of a palm on the other side. Cabilo stood in the hall with one hand against the wood, his body angled, listening for breath through the panel. A nod passed between two men the door could not see. Kwame rose. His chair moved back with a sound the room accepted as a line drawn. We are not done. Zinhle stood to her full height, voice dropping until it was almost kind. Do you think this is you taking control? After all your months of absence, your grief, your... She flicked her wrist toward the window, toward the world outside that had judged and comforted and forgotten him. Your retreat. Men like you do not hold houses together. Women like me do. He stepped around the desk slowly, keeping the room's balance, careful not to rush. Women like you, he said, quiet. And for a moment, his throat threatened to close on the ache of remembering a different woman entirely, one who used to wind a small metal key and set a song free into the dark. He swallowed hard. Say it plainly. Her smile peeled back. I was never meant to be the one on the outside, eating my silence while they called me less. Your first wife's people sneered behind their hands. They cut me with tea and polite words, and doors closed just before I reached them. Her breath quickened, and the glitter slid from her eyes, leaving something raw, something that had learned to choose cruelty when tenderness cost too much. So I learned to keep what I could, and your daughter wears your first life like a badge. Every time I look at her, I see the house I wasn't allowed to enter. She laughed once, low and brittle. I broke the toy because the music was not for me. In the doorway of the study, cables hummed in their casings, tiny red eyes watching from the lamp base and the painting frame. Zinhle's words moved through them and into a recorder in a plain car on the curb. Later, an officer would write them in a report. Later, a judge would hear them without the perfume. Neo's patience snapped. He shoved the door with his shoulder. It gave an inch. The palm outside slid away, and the hallway opened. He stepped into it like a man relieved to feel air on his face, then froze. 2 uniformed officers stood 5 paces down, posture formal, expressions built of training and early mornings. Thabo was with them, his tie crooked, his gaze level and cold. Cabello took his hand from the door and nodded to Kwame, then to the nearest device in the hallway sconce, as if to say, "We have it." "Mr. Diallo," the taller officer said to Neo, voice even. "We have questions regarding documents submitted to the registry this morning. We'll be taking statements." Neo scoffed, the sound thin. Ridiculous. You can't barge into... "We have an order," the officer said, and held up a paper that rustled like a warning. "And we have audio captured under court authorization relating to a planned fraud and the welfare of a child in this home." Zinhle laughed again, that high, bright sound she used to buy herself time. "Audio? Of what? Family disagreements? You men love your gadgets." Cabello lifted his gaze to hers and didn't blink. Of what you just said. Silence cracked open like ice. It lasted the length of a heartbeat and a memory. Then Neo's eyes slid past the men, down the hall, toward the kitchen where a small figure stood partially hidden by a doorway. Amahle, wrapped in a sweater too big for her, clutching the edge of the frame with careful fingers. Her eyes were huge and dark. She didn't move. She had learned not to. Neo took a step toward her. "Don't," Kwame said, and the word rang across the hall, louder than the officers, louder than the clock, louder than the part of himself that had once kept quiet. He moved without thinking, his body a line between the child and the man, who thought power could cross any threshold. His shoulder knocked the study door wider. The folder on the desk slid, loose papers lifting like startled birds and settling again. Neo's mouth twisted. "She is the problem," he said, and something in him, patience, calculation, burned away and left only heat. "Get her out of my way." He lunged. It was fast and graceless. A man used to people making space for him forgot what it felt like to be resisted. The officers were faster. The taller one's arm came up like a gate. The other stepped in from the side, and Neo found his wrist held, and his forward motion turned into a stumble that deposited him back against the wall. The thud shook a framed photograph, Lindiwe on a summer day with the light-making crowns in her hair. The frame tilted, then steadied. Zinhle moved, but it was the kind of movement a body makes when a choice goes quiet. She pressed her palm against the window casing and stared at the street. The bright citrus of her perfume soured at the edges, as if it had been open too long. Thabo stepped closer to Kwame, voice low. "We have enough." His gaze flicked to the devices and back. The forged document, the recorded admissions, the welfare concerns, all of it. Kwame nodded, the motion small. He hadn't realized he had been holding his breath again until air rushed back into him and made him a little dizzy. He lifted his hand and found that it shook, barely visibly. He took one pace backward and another forward, grounding himself in the grain of the floor and the weight of the house he had finally learned how to stand inside. "Amahle," he said, turning slowly. He kept his voice soft enough to not bounce off the walls, steady enough to be a place to land. "Come here." She hesitated, as if the air itself could still punish her for wanting. Then she ran, sudden and small, and collided with him with more force than her thin body seemed to hold. He folded his arms around her, careful of her gauze, careful of how fear makes people fragile and strong at once. Her face pressed into his chest. He could smell the faint soap from her morning wash, the wool of her sweater, the old varnish of the banister. He lowered his chin to her hair and closed his eyes. Behind them, the officer spoke in calm tones that made a map of what would come next. Neo sputtered, then went quiet when a cuff glinted in the corridor light and metal found his wrist. Zinhle whispered something that sounded like a prayer exported from another life and did not bother to finish it. Amahle's shoulders shook once, then again. The sound that came out of her was small at first, and then full. It wasn't loud. It wasn't tidy. It was the sound a child makes when the thing she has been bracing for finally passes and leaves her body trying to figure out how to stop bracing. He tightened his hold by a fraction, not to bind, but to answer. "Dad," she said into his shirt, voice wet and hoarse. "Are we safe yet?" He pressed his cheek to the top of her head. He wanted to promise the kind of safety that lives in fairy tales and stays through breakfast, through school, through the rest of a life. He wanted to build a wall around the two of them and call it a home. His mouth moved, but the words he could honestly give were quieter and older. He slid one hand to the back of her head and felt, in the buzz of the house, footsteps, radios, papers, an old tune waiting for its ending. Almost, he said, and let the word carry everything he meant. I am here. I am not letting go. We are walking into morning, and I will keep the door open and the lights on. He didn't need to explain. She felt the shape of the promise in his body. Outside, sirens never came. This was not that kind of scene. The car door shut with soft thunks. A neighbor's dog barked twice, then remembered it was not his affair. In the study, the brass clock ticked past the hour. On the wall, the photograph of a summer day watched a winter morning learn how to begin again. When he finally lifted his head, the hallway had emptied. The officers had taken their questions to the front step. Thabo stood back to give them air, speaking into his phone with clipped care. Cabello, quiet, retrieved a device from the sconce and slid it into his pocket with a tenderness usually reserved for fragile things. Zinhle had vanished toward the guest room with an officer trailing, the citrus of her perfume thinning into the day. Kwame loosened his hold just enough to see Amahle's face. Her eyes were swollen, her cheeks blotched with heat, but in them there was a steadiness he recognized. Not relief, not yet. The first visible place where courage sets its foot down. He brushed a thumb along her temple. We're going to sit. We'll drink water. We'll wait for Mr. Thabo to finish. Then we'll talk about what happens next. She nodded, and the nod was not small. It was the size of the kitchen table and the porridge bowl, and the plant on the porch, and the music he had asked her to keep. They moved together toward the sitting room. The house no longer felt like a held breath. It felt like an exhale that would take time. On the rug, a glint caught his eye. He bent and picked up the shard of glass he had pocketed, and then lost during the shuffle, thin as a fingernail, one side clean, one jagged. He turned it in the light and felt, as he had in the pantry and the laundry room and the study, the shape of what had been done here and the shape of what would be rebuilt. He slid the shard into his pocket and guided his daughter to the couch. They sat. The window let in a slab of pale daylight that warmed their knees. Somewhere in the house, a door closed softly. The air changed, the way air does when a storm finally accepts it cannot stay. And because silence had kept too many secrets in these rooms, he spoke, not to fill it, but to teach it the right words. I believe you, he said, into the quiet. For the first time with no tremor, no shadow. The word settled in the air between them and made a place where two people could live. She leaned against him as if listening to how belief sounds against bone. The day did not answer. It only opened. 1 month softened the house into something it had not been in a very long time. Morning light no longer slipped along the floors like a trespasser. It entered at ease, laying warm hands on the banister, the kitchen table, the framed photographs that had been cleaned and set straight. The scent of bleach had faded. In its place came porridge and sliced oranges, wet wool by the door, a faint sweetness from beeswax on wood. Even the clock over the stove seemed to tick with a gentler mouth, as if time itself had agreed to walk, not chase. On the porch, the big potted plant stood where it always had, leaves glossy after the rain. Amahle liked to brush a fingertip along the curve of each leaf when she passed it, testing the cool skin, checking for tears. She did it this morning too, before tugging her sweater tighter and stepping into the hall. Her bandages were gone now. In their place, new skin the color of tea, thin and tender still learning the world. She cupped her palms together as she walked, habit more than need. The sound of footsteps came from the stairs, slow and careful. She looked up. Kwame appeared, shoulders dusted with a fine white powder, hair mussed, shirt sleeves rolled. He leaned and pressed his shoulder against a doorframe halfway down, breathing hard, then grinned in the lopsided way she had learned to expect when he was trying to make difficult things appear easy. "It's heavier than I remember," he said, "but it's coming." "What is?" "You'll see." He winked and vanished back up the stairs. The next sound was not footsteps. It was wood against wood. A scrape, a bump, a muffled oath, bitten back before it could take up too much air. Then the angle of a piano appeared, a dark, glossy shoulder easing around the stairwell corner, with the care you give a sleeping child. Two movers guided it inch by inch, belts tight around their waists, breath in sync. Kwame followed them down, one hand steady on the polished side, eyes focused, mouth set. Dust floated in the sun, rising from the stairs like tiny ghosts made of old carpet and long neglect. They settled the instrument in the living room against the far wall, beneath a window that looked toward the big fig tree. The piano's surface showed a constellation of faint scratches. Its keys, when the lid lifted, lay like a row of small teeth. It had not been in this room since before she could remember. It had slept in the basement with the other things that had belonged to the woman whose photograph still watched from the mantel. "Your mother taught herself on this," Kwame said, catching his breath. He kept his palm on the wood as if to steady himself rather than steady it. Used to hum while she practiced, until the whole house felt like it could float. He smiled, a little crooked again. She moved closer and touched the side with 2 fingers. The wood was cool. It smelled like lemon oil, and something deeper, old lacquer perhaps, or the inside of a jewelry box. She thought of the bundle in the drawer upstairs, the cloth holding the broken music box pieces. She thought of the shard of glass he sometimes turned in his pocket, a small thing that could cut, and when held at the right angle catch the light. He sat on the bench and patted the space beside him. When she didn't move, he waited. He had learned the new timing of her. He had learned that sometimes not moving was the kindest way to invite. She came and sat. Their shoulders did not touch. Their knees did, barely. He wiggled his fingers as if warming them over some unseen fire. Then he pressed a single key. The note rang out, a little dull at first, then clearing as if it had to remember how to be sound. He tried another, and another. The room shifted around those small pulses of tone. The house drew breath the way it had done 1 month ago, when everything finally changed, but this time the breath flowed in, not out. In the afternoons, Amahle went to a room with high windows and shelves full of colored paper and empty jars and flat trays of paint that dried at the edges like thin lakes at the end of summer. A woman sat on the floor with the children instead of above them. She gave no grades. She kept no tally. She asked, "Where does that color belong?" and let the answers choose their own shape. Sometimes they all painted with their fingers. Sometimes they made music with whatever could be shaken or struck. Sometimes they sat quiet as cats and watched dust in the light. No one hurried her. No one punished her silence. The door stayed open a hand's width, enough for air to pass, enough to make leaving and coming back look the same. On one of those afternoons, the woman had taken out a small instrument shaped like a crescent moon. She plucked its strings and hummed something that did not have words, a soft shape that folded into itself and then unfolded again. Amahle had drawn a line of charcoal on paper until it curved like river water. She did not sing. She did not know how to trust a sound that had nowhere to hide. At night, sometimes, Kwame drove to a church basement and sat in a circle where people poured coffee into mismatched cups and spoke about weather and traffic until the things beneath were ready to be spoken about. He listened. He realized listening could be a kind of work. He learned to speak, too, in a voice that didn't try to be brave and to be answered by strangers who felt like relatives of the heart. He learned how a promise made to the dead can change shape and still be kept. He learned that strength and apology can wear the same face. The house carried all of this in its new quiet. A month is not long. A month is a beginning that still smells like the day it started. Yet mornings now found the kitchen used. The pantry door no longer had the cold lip of a lock against a child's fingers. The laundry room bulb had been replaced. The calendar showed no lies. The plant on the porch had grown an inch, a new leaf unfurling like a green ear. One Saturday evening, rain waiting beyond the horizon but not yet here, Kwame lit 2 candles on the piano. For warmth, he said, though the air did not need it. The flames made the black lacquer shine like a pond at dusk. He handed her a small box, not wrapped, plain, light in the palm. She opened it. Inside lay a key made for winding, not the old one. This one was new, its metal dull with matte finish, so it wouldn't slip. He smiled at the question on her face. For later, he said. When we have the right song. Her throat went tight, not with fear. With something that lived next door to fear and had the same bones but a kinder face. He placed both hands on the keys. He began with a simple figure, slow and steady, left hand holding ground, right hand drawing a line across it. It was the shape of a path through a field. It was the shape of someone walking where he was meant to go. She watched his fingers. The sound sat open in the room. It asked nothing of her. He shifted the line. The new notes rose and fell like small steps at the edge of sleep. She felt her mouth wanting to hum. She held it still. He didn't look at her. He kept playing. The candles coughed once, then steadied. Outside, a neighbor's window clicked shut. Somewhere, a dog shook itself and settled again. She thought of the room with the shelves of paper. She thought of her palms, healed now, the thin new skin with its invisible map of former hurt. She thought of her mother's face, not the photograph, but the painted memory that had risen uninvited once during art hour. A profile in charcoal and a hint of a smile, no eyes drawn yet, because eyes are the last thing you dare. She thought of a lullaby that had never reached the last note. She thought of the month's worth of mornings when porridge had arrived warm and steady, the bowl, the same bowl, the spoon, the same spoon, the hand setting them down belonging to the man who lived here now, not to the old drift that wore his face. When she opened her mouth, the note that came out surprised her. It was thin at first, a thread pulled carefully from cloth. It held, it rounded. She placed a second note next to the first, like setting down a cup near a plate on a table already laid. She didn't sing words. She didn't need them. The sound rose, then softened, then found a place just above the right hand of the piano where it could rest. He looked at her only after she reached that place. He did not stop playing. He smiled with his eyes, not his mouth. The song widened without growing loud. It made room. She stepped into it again with her voice. This time the note came stronger. It had edges where the first one didn't. It traveled the length of her throat and went somewhere she could not see. She followed it. For a moment, fear tried to untie the knot she had made to keep herself safe. It found nothing to hold. He shifted the left hand. He doubled the ground beneath her sound, thickening it, steadying it, the way a palm steadies the back of a child crossing a stream. Then he took a breath, not to speak, not for courage, but because breath is the string between notes, and he began to hum. His voice did not enter from above. It came up from beneath. It joined hers from the floor, then rose until the two sounds met and learned how to walk beside each other without tripping. The song changed shape, but not direction. It remembered something it had never been allowed to finish. It climbed one rung. It paused. It returned to the first shape. It did not apologize. The candles made small islands of gold on the keys. The dark around them did not feel like danger. It felt like the inside of a pocket, warm with the heat of a held coin. He nodded once. She took the melody higher by the width of a finger. The air in her chest opened wider than hair, wider than string, wider than anything she had expected herself to hold. She didn't look at him now either. She looked at the space above the piano where dust moved through candlelight. She thought with a simple certainty that did not need to be said aloud, "This is mine too." Later, when their throats had thinned with use and the light had walked the room from window to mantel and back again in a slow, quiet circle, he closed the key lid. He placed his palm on the piano like a man saying thank you. He stood and brought a small plate of sliced pear to the bench. They ate without hurry. She licked juice from her thumb and laughed softly when it dripped to her wrist. He took a cloth from his pocket and wiped it away with the care one gives to gold. Domestic gestures are the architecture of a life. Some buildings are only one story. They can still be home. He fetched the bundle from the drawer, cloth worn thin, not gentle, and set it on the bench between them. He untied the knot and let the broken music box pieces spill into his hand. She didn't flinch. They gleamed like little stars that had fallen in a past storm and never found their sky again. "We could fix it," he said. "Or we could keep it like this, to remind us how it sounded trying to play while everything was breaking." She looked at the bent crank pin. She looked at the sliver of brass. She looked at his hand holding them open, not trying to hide the cut edges. "Keep it," she said, "but let it live near the piano. Near, not on. Near," she said, "so we can hear one song end and another begin." He nodded. The answer felt right in his body. He slid the pieces back into their cloth and tied the knot again, less tight than before. He set the bundle on the far right corner of the piano, where candle heat would reach it, but never burn it. Rain began then. Not hard, not urgent. Just the steady tapping of 1,000 fingers testing the roof. The house answered with its own quiet language. Pipes settling, floorboards relaxing, the fridge humming low. He lit a third candle and placed it on the mantel before the photograph of Lindiwe. The flame trembled once, then took. "I spoke at group yesterday," he said, voice low enough to belong to the room and not fight it. "I told them about promises that survive by changing shape. I told them I thought love might be a workbench, not a glass box. I told them I am learning to be a father out loud." She listened without needing to be an adult. She reached for the new winding key and turned it in her hand. It was heavy for its size. It sat well between her forefinger and thumb. "Will we wind something?" she asked. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight we sing. When the time comes, we'll wind as a habit, not as a rescue." She tilted her head, as if weighing that idea. She placed the key on the piano lid where his hand could find it if his mind forgot. He didn't move it. He wanted it there. A small promise made of metal. A thing made to turn on purpose. They played again, less now, just the shape of the melody humming under breath. Words would have been too much. Between the 2 candles and the rain and the hum of the refrigerator, the house felt like a chest filling and emptying, steady, sane. The plant on the porch tapped its leaves against the rail. The big fig tree folded the street into itself and held it for the night. When they finally closed the lid and cleared the bench, he turned off the lamps. Darkness pooled gently, as if poured with care. The only light came from the candles, their halos firm, their edges soft. Faces looked older in that light and kinder. The piano's surface reflected the flames in 2 oblong blurs. In that small held mirror he could see their silhouettes. Not ghosts, not warnings, just people who had been found. They didn't speak then. There was nothing words could do that the music had not already carried to where it needed to go. He traced the top of the bench with a fingertip and felt the nick his ring had made years ago when a laugh had surprised him, and his hand had jumped. He left the nick as it was. Imperfections keep a thing faithful to its story. He walked her to the foot of the stairs. She paused beside the plant without thinking and touched the youngest leaf. It shivered. She smiled at the leaf, at herself, at the idea that even green things remember hands. He rested his palm lightly on the banister, not blocking, just there. She climbed 2 steps, then turned back. "Do you think it will stay like this?" she asked. Not a trick, not a plea. A child's simple physics. If a thing is in motion, will it continue? He considered. The candles clicked softly as wax found cooler air and set. The rain deepened to a hush. He lifted his eyes to the photograph on the mantel and let his answer find its shape without rushing. "It will change," he said, "but we will change with it. We keep the room warm. We keep the door open. We keep the song honest. When we forget, we learn again. And you can always call me from the porch, even if you only whisper." She nodded like someone setting a stone where it belongs. She went up the rest of the stairs, her hand sliding along the rail, the sweater hanging loose at her hips. At the landing, she turned once more, not to check if he was still there, but to make a picture of him in this light. She would take it with her to sleep. He stood at the bottom until her door clicked softly. He let a long breath go. It did not wobble. He moved to the piano and lifted the cloth-wrapped bundle once more, felt the weight, then put it back down. He touched the new winding key. He left it exactly where she had placed it. He extinguished 1 candle with a pinch. The second he blew out slowly, watching the smoke curl into a thin gray ribbon that drifted and then disappeared. He left the 3rd candle burning, small and stubborn, before the photograph. He walked to the window and looked out at the street made glossy with rain. The car slid by, tires whispering. Somewhere, someone laughed and then closed an umbrella. He pressed his fingertips to the glass, then drew them back and looked at the prints. 10 little ovals, a human signature. Proof a body had been warm beside a cold night. Behind him, the piano sat like a patient friend. The room kept its shape. The plant on the porch lifted its new leaf toward the dark. He did not ask the house to promise him anything. He made his promise to it instead. He would fill it with small, honest sounds. He would count his steps when anger remembered the way. He would write notes on the calendar that would not lie. He would wind music only when music asked. He would keep the night gentle and the mornings hot with porridge. He would stand in the door when needed and move aside when that was kinder. He would be a father out loud. The rain carried on. The candle flame leaned, then straightened. The last of the light swam along the piano's surface and made the room look like a lake. He saw her there beside him as a reflection, not a puddle that had held fear, but a clean mirror that welcomed faces. The song they had begun hovered at the edge of ending. He felt the missing note and did not chase it. He let it come when it wanted, like a bird that knows which windows are safe. He closed his eyes and heard it anyway. Soft, certain, not far. He opened his eyes and smiled. The music box pieces gleamed like a small constellation. The key waited, weighty and simple. The room sighed, a contented old animal, and settled, and in the flicker of candlelight, father and daughter's voices lingered like a thread, drawn through a darkness that had finally learned how to loosen. The melody of a home finding its shape, the echo of a woman's gentle song living on, not as a ghost, but as breath and wood and hands that know how to hold without hurting. When the storms of life recede, what remains is not the wreckage, but the quiet courage to rebuild. Every wound carries the possibility of becoming a scar that tells a story, not of weakness, but of survival. Pain does not erase love, it deepens it, sharpening our sense of what matters most. In the end, what saves us is never power or possession, but the fragile, stubborn thread of trust we weave between one heart and another. There are moments when silence can wound as deeply as cruelty, when the absence of a voice feels heavier than the weight of a shout. Yet there are also moments when a single word of belief, a single act of gentleness, has the power to restore what was broken. The truth may take time to be heard, but it always waits, patient and insistent, until we are ready to carry it. We are reminded that love is not a grand performance. It is the daily act of showing up, of listening without distraction, of holding space for another's fear and another's hope. It is in the way a hand steadies a trembling one, the way a home becomes a refuge, not because it is flawless, but because it is honest. Love is not found in perfect moments. It is created in the fragile, messy places where forgiveness and resolve choose to meet. And so, the deeper lesson endures. Healing is not about erasing the past, but transforming it into a foundation strong enough to hold the future. What was once a song cut short can begin again, carried by voices that have learned to tremble and still rise. In the rhythm of ordinary days, meals shared, doors kept open, light kept burning, we find the extraordinary gift of belonging. The journey is not about conquering shadows once and for all. It is about learning to keep a candle lit when night falls, knowing that dawn will come, because we chose to keep faith with one another. Every act of compassion ripples outward, a quiet resistance against despair, a reminder that dignity and tenderness are never wasted. This story is just one reflection of what it means to be human, to stumble, to doubt, to grieve, and then to begin again, guided not by certainty, but by the promise that love, once chosen, can endure. Thank you for walking through this journey with open hearts. If this story touched you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to join us for more stories that explore the strength of the human spirit, please follow and subscribe. Your presence helps keep these voices alive. Together we continue the conversation, one story, one heart at a time.